outcomes and the discussions for the next hour, and follow up with a panel discussion. So by way of introduction to myself, I'm really pleased to be here to be able to talk to you today. My name is James Norris, and I'm the International Policy Lead at Ordnance Survey. Ordnance Survey is the national mapping agency of Great Britain, and my role is a global role to promote the value that geography and geospatial data has in transforming economies, in sustaining the environment, and more broadly to make the world a better place. I've had a variety of roles in the DRR space. I've recently worked with GEO, the Group on Earth Observations, where I led their work on Earth observations for the Sendai Framework for Monitoring, and through that worked very closely with colleagues at UNDRR, and was proud to be able to contribute to the 2019 version of the Global
Greetings from
Assessment
Ankara.
Report.
I'm Ahmet Kürşat Dostor, Vice President of Turkstat. I will give
Greetings to you.
brief information about how we try to measure the impact of Kahramanmaraş earthquakes.
I think we have a. Thank you. If you are listening in online, please mute. To introduce the panel itself, we have Mr. Florent McIsaac from the World Bank, who will be delivering our keynote in a few minutes. Florent is the economist at the Climate Change Group at the World Bank, where he focuses on macroeconomics and climate policy, assessing the impacts of climate change on macroeconomic and financial systems at the national and global level. Later on in our panel session, we have Mr. Rob Deacon, who is the Resilience Manager at Land Information New Zealand, LINZ. Hi, Rob. And he leads LINZ's work program
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, colleagues. Apologies, I just have a message from our moderator, James, that his internet has just died. I'm just wondering if we can give him 30 seconds to get his internet back up and running. Thank you very much, and apologies. Hello again. This is Mark Iliff from the United Nations Statistics Division and also the lead organizer for session 4. While we give James some time to get his internet back online, I would like to continue with introducing the participants for today's session. Picking up from where James left off, Rob Deacon leads Land Information New Zealand's work programme to improve New Zealand's resilience to natural and other hazards, also including the understanding the impacts of climate change. From Brazil, from Brazil Center for Natural Disasters is Mr. Tiago Bernardes, who works with SEMADEN as a operational analyst, where he leads SEMADEN's work on disaster-related statistics in collaboration with IBGE, the National Statistical Office of Brazil. Also from the continent, we have Ms. Macarena Perez, who is the Head of Strategic Alliances and Networks at the Chile Institute for Disaster Resilience. She's a geographer by background and was previously the Executive Secretary of the National System for Territorial Information Coordination, where she oversaw the national coordination of Chile's national spatial data and geospatial information, and helped bring together the working group related to emergency situations before disasters. Also joining you in Bangkok is Mr. Rahul Sengupta, who is the Program Management Officer at UNDRR, supporting several programs related to the strengthening of disaster risk and resilience. I understand, James, that you are back online, in which case I will hand it over to you and commend
Thank you, Mark.
distinguished session panelists to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark, and really appreciate you stepping in whilst I just had a few connectivity problems and completing the panelists for you. Conscious that we have a lot to cover, I won't have a deep dive into the reason for us having this meeting, apart from to give a few opening remarks to talk about as we talk about in the briefing note. We are now facing a triple planetary crisis that has been recognized by many agencies, and we have that interlinkages between climate change, pollution, and biodiversity loss that all has their own individual causes and effects. And as we know, combined, these issues are already starting to cause cascading issues for humanity, increasing our vulnerability and impacts to disasters and making us as a whole less resilient. We know that when disasters first occur, after the first issue about assessing the loss of life and injuries, stakeholders quickly turn to the economic impact of that disaster and what processes and practices they need to put in place to avert future losses. And so really pleased today to be able to have this session with you at the Expert Forum for Producers and Users of Disaster-Related Statistics to talk about the role that national statistical frameworks have, the role that National Geospatial Disaster Agency have in bringing together some sort of coherence and cohesion across the different national institutional arrangements. And hopefully through the end of this session, we will have highlighted some of the scopes and measurements of direct and indirect disasters to you, talking about some of the delayed and onset disasters. And hopefully we'll also discuss some of the loss and damage and funding mechanisms that are really at that nexus of climate change and disaster related, both from a user perspective, but also anchored by a producer perspective. So without any further ado, I think I will hand over now, please, to Mr. Florin McIsaac from the Climate Change Group at the World Bank. And Florin will give a short 10 or so minute presentation for us on the work that the World Bank is doing in defining direct and impact of disasters. So Florin, over to you, please.
Thank you very much, James. I don't know if you have my slides available. Perfect. Thank you very much. So first, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everybody, wherever you are. I'm very pleased to be here today with you to present some of our work. I want to thank the organizers for the opportunity to be here. My task today will be to identify some of the challenges that are inherent with the scope of measuring direct and indirect impacts of disasters, and all of it within 10 minutes. So maybe I will not be able to cover absolutely everything, but I want to give you a highlight on some of the latest work that the World Bank has been doing in that capacity. Perhaps next slide, please. think I had another slide before, maybe not. Okay. So my presentation will be based on this paper that you can find. Yes, this is the slide I had in mind. So climate disasters increasingly require a policy response. Usually, basically, we have, in terms of policy response of different disasters, when we have high frequency disasters, usually they are not extremely significant to GDP, and insurance policies could be enough in order to cover to cover for these disasters and find some economic efficiency. However, when a very large disaster occurs, the type of response you would expect is completely different, because the size and the magnitude of the shock penetrate into the system in a nonlinear fashion. And therefore, the type of recovery and the type of response that would be needed would be completely different. And of course, climate change makes things a little worse. And on the left-hand side, just for example, what you get is this usual chart of the probability of the different temperatures, and you see this probability shifting to the right, meaning that there will likely be more and more of these extreme events that require some very specific policy response, as well as extreme events that are in uncharted territories, which is basically the red part in a way on the left hand side of the graph. This is somewhat the uncharted territory that we are expecting some new disasters emerging from new climate conditions. And we have disasters that used to be there that would be becoming more and more frequent. So it's something to have in mind, looking ahead and trying to build the simulations and the policy response moving ahead. And you have on the right-hand side just a representation of the 50-year event that is no longer the 50-year event as global temperature rises, in the sense of here in this illustration, what used to be 1 in 50-year events would occur 39.2 times more frequently. So it will become kind of a yearly event in a way, roughly speaking, should we reach plus 4 degrees Celsius, which is for our modeling, for the way that we see these shocks, it's changing in its nature, in the sense that something that was very less frequent will becoming the standard, which is something that our model should take into consideration and anticipate some of the policy response that I will discuss in this presentation. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, the presentation will be based on this paper, which is macroeconomic modeling. Basically, what we're essentially doing here, we are taking so this is for Turkey. We do an application for flood and earthquakes, where we have data for earthquakes, especially that are specialized with different types of buildings that are being built with different material, and we overlay this information of the spatial representation with the seismic modeling that help us make some simulations on how much capital could be destroyed should an earthquake occurs. So we worked on this paper a year ago or so it was before the earthquake happened in Turkey at the beginning of the year. So unfortunately, this paper in a way had traction. Yes, okay, I will move on to the next slide as it has changed. So roughly speaking, the direct impact of natural disasters, looking at from a modeling perspective, from the macro modeling perspective, what you usually get is you have the different strengths of capital before disaster, capital 1, 2, until n, that is aggregated into this big capital stock. And after the disaster, some of the capital will be damaged or will be destroyed, shrinking the quantity of capital available for the production process. Of course, this is very direct impact. How can we infer from this disaster? There is also some other considerations that's worth mentioning: loss of life, disruption to normal life, etc. In this presentation, I will rather focus on the macro aspect of things as opposed to the micro, but acknowledging that the micro is also extremely important for this debate. Next slide, please. So moving on to the indirect impact, and this is where the complexity is coming from, as James introduced it a little before my presentation. There is a general equilibrium effect. Often the natural disasters is viewed as a demand shock that will then propagate into the system with price response, with monetary policy response, with demand responses, and so on and so forth. So now moving from what has been the loss of capital to what is the economic loss that the economy will face. And of course, this is even more complicated in the sense that there will be some policy response, and there's also a time dimension to it in order to compute to compute the economic response. So there is some economic disruption that propagates through the value-added chain in the short term, in the medium term, and in the long term. There will also be some social disruption going more into the micro level, but it will also have some environmental damages that could impair the productivity of some other capital assets that the economy has beyond just what has been destroyed. Next slide, please. So here you have a representation of the paper of some of the indirect impact, and I would ask you to focus only on the black line, where you have on the x-axis the direct losses to GDP that we are simulating, and you have on the y-axis what is the net present value consumption loss, which is a proxy in our paper for welfare. And basically, one of the first conclusions we have here is indirect impacts can be as strong as direct impacts, and actually could be even stronger in the sense that you have the 45-degree line, and here in these simulations, basically, should the direct losses be beyond approximately 6% of GDP, we see that the indirect impact that's generating from the economic model will translate into a higher loss of welfare. And so, of course, as I mentioned, there's a non-trivial time dimension to this that we are capturing through the net present value. And there are also some non-linearities. As you see, the losses that we have in this model is somewhat convex, so therefore is increasing as the strength of the natural disaster increases. Next slide, please. So maybe to give you some ideas of what it was behind this black line. First, we focused on the paper on the role of productivity, because remember when we had the capital stock that is damaged through a disaster occurring, you have less capital. But one of the questions is the diminished productive capital stock that is available does it have the same productivity? And our answer is no, and we provide some evidence to that, in the sense that when you have some critical roads, just to give you a sense of why we come up with this conclusion and how it is supported data as well, when we have a critical road that's being hit, the productivity of all the different assets on the other end of the road would also be impaired, although the capital hasn't been destroyed in a way, but the productivity of this capital is lower until we rebuild this critical road, for example, and you can take many other examples. So there is a role of productivity in this story, and so disaster will affect the capital stock, but will also affect the total factor productivity as two independent processes. And something to take into account. So here the remark I want to suggest for this panel is a more granular representation of productivity impacts.
Le rôle de la productivité
y mayor resiliencia de.
القدرة على التكيف في أنظمتنا.
Come to the next slide, please. And so the second aspect that I wanted to mention besides productivity today is the importance of measuring reconstruction. Because the response you have from the natural disaster
La riposte à apporter à la catastrophe naturelle
is also a major demand shock through reconstruction. Which means that we will need to allocate resources and take that into consideration into the modeling that is needed for assessing the indirect impacts of natural disaster. And just also to give an idea, and for example, how reconstruction matters and the timing of reconstruction as well, is that if all investments are the same, and there will be no structural constraint, then reconstruction should be almost immediate in a way. And just to give an example, looking at Katrina in New Orleans, what has been destroyed represents only 2 weeks of US investments. So should there be no frictions in our system, we should be able to recover quite quickly. But of course, there are lots of frictions to take into consideration, which could take the form of some financial frictions, technical frictions, institutional incentives, basically the capacity of the economy to mobilize resources at a given location after the disaster occurs. Maybe moving on to the next slide. And how to prioritize reconstruction. So here you have an important graph that I wanted to share with you today, which is the wages of qualified roofers in Miami after the 2004 hurricane season. And what you observe is quite above baseline or above all other occupations increase in wages right after the hurricane season. That was pretty damages. And of course, this so you have basically the supply shock that usually translates into higher prices. And you also have the demand shock that could also lead to higher prices into some specific sectors of the economy that is important to take into consideration. And so something that wanted to mention as well is that reconstruction investments have a higher return than greenfield investment. This is something important, especially when we add the productivity aspects, because this reconstruction investment would not only add to capital stock in a way, but also will allow other capital to be more productive through the total factor productivity. And so this is definitely something that I want to put here in this conversation, is that a more granular representation of disaster impacts and reconstruction would help assess monetary policy options as well, but also tracking quite carefully the reconstruction data of the response of the natural disaster, because they have different nature than just the FBCF, the GFCF, for example. Would be interesting in order to have a better understanding of how some policy response are helping the economy building resilience, increasing resilience when major disasters are occurring. And next slide, please.
Florent, may I ask you to start thinking about wrapping up quickly?
I'm about to wrap up. Thank you.
Thank you.
So one of the last ideas that I want to put out there, and what the paper does as well, is to try to distinguish between public and private capital in the policy response of what has been destroyed from public infrastructure, that includes buildings as well, and private infrastructure. Why? Because to account for the public and private investments are both in different type of constraints that we need to take into account when looking at this data and putting this data in a model, because the public capital or private capital will face different decision-making processes. They'll have different funding resources, and they have different timing constraints for rebuilding different types of assets. In the sense that mobilizing other resources in order to redirect towards construction face different constraints, whether this capital is on the public sphere or on the private sphere. And my very last slide is the last idea I wanted to put out there is the role of heterogeneity, meaning that here the different disasters which triggers different responses, and so keeping track of basically the source of the disaster and how they originate and went through the economic system is also very important, because here you have a just a representation of how a drought or a flood or a storm impact inflation in the short, medium, and long term, and you see that some of the responses could differ on the nature of natural disasters. So it's not only looking at natural disaster as a whole, but also looking at more granular type of disasters that the economy faced. And I will leave the presentation here. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Florent, and I really appreciate your insight today into the work that you've been doing in the World Bank Group. And just a very quick reflection from myself, as a policy professional, I really like the language that you've started to use around the policy response for disasters, and I especially like the two call outs you had in terms of kind of having a more granular representation of data will help to design a more effective response. And that leads us really nicely onto our first kind of set of questions that we have for the panelists. So I would like to make sure we have our four panelists available and on, or with cameras on and available to us. So just a reminder, we have Tiago with us, thank you. We have Macarena, we have Rahul, and we have Rob Deacon. I think I'd like to address the first question to Tiago. So please just, and I will ask all of our panelists to provide a minute or two's thought on these questions. But our first question, Tiago, is what is the role of the national statistical system in defining direct and indirect impacts of disasters? And more importantly, I presume, as based on Florent's question just then, how can we use national statistical agencies and organizations to strengthen those arrangements? Tiago, over to you for your thoughts.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
I can, yes.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me for this discussion. I'm very, it's a very pleasure to participate in this discussion. First, I would like to present you, introduce the main agencies engaged in statistics and population monitoring disasters in Brazil. We have the Brazilian Institute for Geography Statistics, which is responsible, the provider of data about the information in the country. And we have the National Center for Monitoring and Early Warning of Natural Disasters, which is responsible for monitoring and issuing alerts about 1,000 vulnerable municipalities over the territory the Brazilian territory. After all, we have the Senad, another agency that is responsible for recording information about natural disasters in Brazil. Since we have all of these agencies working on natural disasters and that information, I think we first need to identify who will be responsible for recording and assist in defining rules for recording and integration information about impacts in Brazil. I would like to highlight these questions where we have to deal mainly with questions of coordination and cooperation in order to avoid duplication efforts on data collection and analysis.
Thank you very much. Appreciate the introduction you have given us to the situation in Brazil and how the multiple agencies are starting to work together. And it sounds like there are opportunities for further strengthening later on. And perhaps we can pick that up in some of the other questions as we go along. Macarena, I wonder whether I could address the same question to yourself in terms of the role of the National Statistical Organization in Chile and how it links to the current disaster programs and how potentially there is a need to strengthen. So Macarena, over to you. I think you are still on. There you go.
Okay, can you hear me?
I can now, thank you.
Okay, thank you, James, and good morning, everyone. Good evening. First of all, I want to thank the opportunity to share not only my experience in this subject, also the kind of work that we've been doing here in Chile related with information for disasters resilience in my specific position at this moment. So we are working here in a technological and research public institute. That is the main activity that we are trying to do right now. As ITREN, our mission is to create public goods and services and articulate the research and scientific-based innovation capacities that we have in Chile to reduce the economical, social, and environmental impact of disasters, working with different areas of technical issues. For example, we work with the private sector, with industry. They had a lot of information. I worked for the past 10 years for the public sector, and I always knew that, of course, the insurance and the private sector indeed had a lot of information that is not always available for the public sector and for the authorities or for the public policy. So in this institute, we are working to collaborate and to improve that relation. Also, we are working with the social society network. There, of course, in different countries had a lot of really important information. They are the first that are there when something happened. In our case in Chile, as you know, we have almost all the kind of disasters that any country can have. So there's a big network with a lot of people, but I think one of the most challenges here is not only to have the information and to make public information, it's also what kind of data we are using and how we can track that kind of information. For example, the last summer, we have a really big wildfires here with, of course, a big impact in the central area of Chile. And at this moment, we are working with the Minister of Science to put all the information that we know that exists for a lot of years, that academia has working on, related with different models that can improve how we are prepared to respond of the wildfires, to be more prepared for the next season. I know there is a big issue in different countries, of course, related directly with the climate change, but there's not only where is information, is how to connect that kind of things. I think in our country, it's not only the statistical department from the government, there's a lot of agencies that create information. The academia, I think, is one of the, is the most important. But I think the link and the how you connect that kind of stakeholders is one of the big issues too.
Thank you, Macarena. That is some really interesting concept you raised there, and I especially like the way you started talking about the role of the technology and public research institutes working together. We've touched on the role of civil societies and NGOs, and we have that underlying view and need for statistics to be authoritative and to come from an authoritative source. But actually, we recognize there are many different actors who can provide that data. So turning quickly, or not quickly, but turning to Rob Deacon now. Rob, would you have a few comments on the same question in terms of how we can strengthen our institutional arrangements?
Yes, certainly. And thinking of the system overall, there are a few key components to it. And as Florence outlined, it's quite a complex set of variables to consider when we're looking at loss and damage. And typically from a New Zealand perspective, and perhaps in a number of other countries, we're very reliant on the academic and the research communities to establish the methods and the evidence around understanding loss and damage. So that there's a key component there of being able to have that sort of that academic understanding of the concepts that we're dealing with and translating that into estimates of loss and damage. And there's also a key role for organizations such as a National Disaster Management Agency at the center who perhaps have ownership of the policy responses to disasters and loss and stewardship of the system. And then if we think about the reporting of that at a national statistics level, then having the support and guidance in terms of statistical methods and reporting at a national level is key. So there are three key components there. And thinking about the institutional arrangements to link those type of components together is something that I think is often missing. And then there are other connections that need to be made into the on-the-ground service providers, the utility providers, and a lot of the local government who are often left with the response and recovery activities. So it is a complex system that requires that tying together of scientific understanding of policy response and statistical methods. So it is really a challenge, I think, for us all to tie those together in a much more coordinated way to improve the strength of those institutional arrangements.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you very much for that, Rob. I'm conscious of time, and I know we have just started a fantastic discussion on the first question, but I hope you don't mind if we move on to our second question now on what are some of the key challenges when translating models of disaster loss into statistical data. I'm conscious that, Rahul, you did not have the opportunity to answer the last question, but perhaps if I could come to you to start off with this question. And again, if I will ask any of the audience members that if they have any questions or suggestions or experiences on any of the questions we pose, please to put them in the chat and we can follow up with them afterwards. But Rahul, perhaps I can come to you, please, on this question on challenges translating models of disaster loss into statistical data.
Thank you so much. I was feeling a little lonely at this table, it looks like in a baseball stadium when they suddenly focus on you, and then your picture comes up on the wide screen. That's how I was been feeling. But the jokes apart, on this particular question, I'd like to put some things in a bit of perspective. When we are talking about the modeling, so loss modeling, it can never be directly translated into statistical data. It's more coming from created, or rather the modeling uses historical data and uses analytical tools for predictive analysis, so that they can make future predictions for scenarios of, let's say when the natural hazards, and I would like to underline that natural hazards and refrain from saying natural disasters, because that's what's being created, or the effects of the natural hazards. So statistical data, on the other hand, is really, really key, because as we can see in the deliberations that we have had in the last, we can say 1.5 days, the focus is on actual realized risks. Means you can have the best predictive models, yet when the hazards do not realize themselves, you will not get the data that the statistical data that we're looking at in terms of the disaster data. And that is extremely important, and that is why we are advocating very strongly for disaster loss tracking systems, because it's not the big earthquake, the big tsunami that's making is the only thing that needs to be looked into. I mean, the CNN is there and the BBC is there, to give you the picture of what happened to the big kind of events, but it's really the small events, the small fire, the small floods that are happening at the local level, that cumulatively have in many countries shown to be as big, or if not a large proportion of the total losses. And that's very important, and hence this is very important in terms of having this as official data, and that's official statistical data. That's most important, and that will really support the what is mentioned as the loss modeling systems in the countries, because that eventually helps risk governance and investments in risk. Thank you so much.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for that, and I appreciate you being the lone voice in the room. But I'm glad we have come to you, and thank you for sharing some of the expertise and some of the conversations that you've had over the last few days. I know they have been very valuable and very welcomed. Tiago, I'm wondering whether I could come to you, please, on the same or the similar question in terms of your experiences of that translation of disaster loss into statistical data, and whether you could share your views, please. I think you may still be on system mute, unfortunately, Tiago. It's okay.
Sorry. Can you hear me?
We have you now. I can.
Yes. Well, as we were working the last years, I've been working on registering, recording information about disasters. Our main concerns about these questions, it's about two aspects: the estimation and uncertainty questions. In our experiences, in many cases, data on disaster losses may not be clear or directly available. For instance, on recording information in our database, we struggle in identifying the exact event has caused a given impact, specifically in generalized multi-hazard events where storms, floods, and landslides occurs simultaneously. So that's a problem we have in registering. The other question is about data availability and quality. In Brazil, large cities or more populated areas have a plenty of information about disasters, especially for larger events. But it's more difficult to find small size or low impact events in remote areas and small cities. That's two questions I would like to highlight.
And on that, have you started to come up with some methods and methodologies of capturing that statistical data, or is it still a pure problem you have at the moment?
No, we have working on a database. We call it Rain Desk. It's an information we have been working at Semadane since 2016, and that's one thing we have worked for about 7 years, and we have already about 2,000 entries in this database, mostly small events and for floods, landslides, and flash floods. So we have mostly worked on this database, and that's what I would like to highlight here.
Okay, thank you very much. Rob, I'm going to come to you next, if you don't mind, and picking up on two parts really. You were mentioning earlier on about kind of the role of providers and the role of local actors. Tiago was just talking about the challenge of data availability and data quality. And I was wondering whether you in New Zealand have similar challenges and how you have started to address some of those problems.
We certainly do have similar challenges. So, for instance, we've recently, in January, February, were impacted by 2 cyclone events in the north of the country that caused damage across 4 or 5 main regions. And to get an overall picture of the damages across those regions has been quite difficult, because the damage assessments are all undertaken by local response agencies who have responsibility for dealing with the response and recovery at a local level. So to aggregate up from that to get a picture of national damage from such an event is quite tricky, particularly in the short term, because the assessments are all made in slightly different ways, and there aren't established methods for aggregation, which makes life tricky. So I think it has, for us, highlighted gaps in our system around responsibilities and process that need to be addressed. And that's in terms of response and recovery management, but also in terms of collection of data. So it is a problem for us. And I think also the timeframes where we talk about loss and damage are quite important. There's getting a handle on direct impacts in the short term is relatively easy, even if it's done inconsistently. But to look at loss through cascading impacts over a period of time that goes from days to weeks to months to years, and even decadal, to get an appreciation of loss, a lot depends on the timeframes that we're looking at, and often recovery goes into decadal cycles for major events. So there are lots of complexities and lots of different viewpoints to add to that.
Thank you there, Rob. And yes, the complexities is something we are never going to get away from, but actually it is where events like this, talking about the producers and users for disaster-related statistics, that we can start to hopefully overcome and share some of the challenges that we had. I'm conscious we have a few minutes left, so perhaps I would just like to come to Macarena to start off with this question in terms of defining and measuring direct and indirect impacts of disasters. what we can do better. And then I would just like to invite every one of our speakers to provide a short update, maybe 30 seconds max on this question before then I'll come to Florent for your final thoughts before I wrap up. But Macarena, do you have any views on how we can better define the problems that we have?
Yes, I want just to explain very shortly. There are two initiatives that we are working at this moment. One of those is related with the ESCAP 2020. There's an index, maybe some of the people that are here know this index. Is related, it's made by the IDB, and it's related with governance and public policy in disaster risk management. We applied in the Institute this index for the 2020. We are going to apply it again for next year. And there's a lot of specific things related with, with resilience, but with measure how is the impact in different aspects related with disasters. So that information is now available. I can share by the chat of the Zoom. And at this moment, we're working with some specific ministers here in Chile. Some work with the Minister of Energy, some specific work with the Minister of National Assets to just make a specific focus and determine how we can build better, not only in the structural part, but it's more related with the social matters. And the second idea that I have is a specific model that we are working with the Chilean Insurance Association. They are part of ITREN, and we make a public infrastructure risk and exposure model. First, we are working with earthquakes because we have a lot of information related with that. We can make models based on the past events, and we're hoping to cover the cost of repairing critical public infrastructure affected by disaster, but not the infrastructure that is already had insurance. I mean the schools, the hospitals, and that kind of specific infrastructure in a local specific territory. So that is the two projects that we're working right now. I can share all the links by the chat if you want to check out.
Please do, Macarena. Please do share links in the chat. There is a question on the chat that is directed to Rahul. I don't think we're going to have time to get to it in the final 2 minutes, but perhaps Rahul, you could respond to the question in the chat offline and make sure we have an answer to that one. With only a minute to go, perhaps Florent, I would just like to come to you for a couple of concluding thoughts from your opening challenges that you had. And how you just see the conversation has gone and our opportunities going forward. So, Florent, a few remarks, please.
Thank you very much, and a very, very interesting conversation. And it seems that it's a conversation that we'll have more and more frequently moving forward. What I see from the discussions that we had is basically we acknowledge a lot the complexity of the task, and that we need to move on to having some more granular information, but also overlay of a type of modeling as Macarena was mentioning, that was quite interesting in trying to couple information on infrastructure with some risk type of exposure modeling. That basically would help certainly understand better the type of analysis, because we are slightly moving into some critical analysis where we understand that there are specific nodes in the system that we should particularly take care of in order to mitigate as much as we can the consequences of these disasters. So it was very, very useful conversation. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you. And I'm really pleased that you have found the conversation useful. I will try and wrap up in less than 1 minute to keep us on time. I know we have a busy day ahead of us, but just like to say thank you very much to the organizers for pulling this session on together. For those of you in the room who have been an active participant in the chat, we hope that some of the conversation will help stimulate some debate through the rest of the day, especially in the role that national statistical offices have in working with national disaster or geospatial agencies in the collection and accurate collection of data. I think that's all that's left for me to do is to thank all of our speakers, to thank Florin for your keynote, Macarena for your insights from Chile, from Tiago from Brazil, from Rob from your New Zealand perspective, and finally for Rahul from a UNDRR perspective, and to be our person in the ground and to be able to follow up any questions that they might have in the room. I thank everyone for your time today. And wish you a great rest of the conference and look forward to your outcomes over the next few days. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Ciao.
Yes, so we just have a few 2-3 minutes transition time. So if I can ask that has to be very quick. We are moving on to the next session in 1 minute.
One question. She spoke about IBB index that they have developed, but it is not yet available. Maybe a link, something. IBB index, she said about the indirect impact. Amelia, she'll share in the chat, yes, if possible. Can we get it? Okay.
Okay, we can get a message to Macarena. Yeah, thanks for that. Good, thank you. So let's transition to the next session. Wafa is chairing. Oh, that's excellent. So you won't be sitting all alone. All right. So we are moving into measuring human impacts of disaster. So we just have 2 minutes basically to breathe a little bit. I leave that one.
From national disaster. See if he's on that.
Evening from Bangkok, and welcome to session 5. We had, this is the second full day, and we were very pleased with all the panelists and all the session. We have this session 5 on measuring human impacts of disasters. And myself, I'm Wafa Abul Hasn, from the Chief of Economic Statistics from ESCAP, the Economic and Social Commission for West Asia. I have my colleagues who helped me co-organize this session. And I will present the speakers. If you would like to, next slide. Okay, the objectives of the session are measuring the human impacts of disaster, improving the accuracy of data reporting on death, displacement, migration, and incorporating gender in the data collection, and how to use human impact to meet post-disaster needs and inform policy decisions from the user perspective. Next. We have 3 key questions like the other sessions. In many areas, many countries, we have large data gaps on population and their characteristics. What are the challenges to develop a DRR strategy? And how can the data contribute to effective early warning systems, and how they can be implemented in areas with limited resources and infrastructure? The second question is, what are the current technological innovations and tools being used to improve data collection and reporting on human impacts of disasters? How can data integration be also utilized in this aspect? The last question is, when disaster hits, how can we estimate the number of affected persons during and after the disaster? Women, children, old people, disabled, poor. And how can some already existing statistical systems like the CRVS, which is the civil registration and vital statistics, help in matching the data and complementing this data? So these are our 3 questions. If you would like just to move to the next question. I have just here a chart that we got from the global UNSD database on SDGs. We know that the SDGs on disasters has many indicators repeated on disasters. I just want to show that this is for the Arab countries. We have many data gaps on reporting on disasters in Arab countries. Not all report, and when they report, it's not on disaggregated data, not all years. So there's a lot of data gaps that are challenging when we have disasters. The next slide. So our speakers, we are very pleased to have with us, and honored to have with us, the Vice President of the Turkish Statistical Institute, Mr. Ahmed Kursad Dusdogru. He's gonna present to us measuring the impact of the Kahramanmaras earthquakes. We all know like the earthquakes that happen in Turkey. And we will be very happy to hear how did Turkstat deal with providing data to policymakers. At the same time, we have on the Turkish earthquakes, Mr. Harry Mahmoud, who is humanitarian in the Humanitarian Open Street Map, OSM, in the Asia Pacific team, Disaster Services Manager. He will show us on the ground how they worked with citizen data, citizen-generated data to support disaster response. And like we said, the use case is from Turkey and Syria earthquake. Mr. Harry was teaching GIS in Indonesia, and he has been with OSM for quite a while. The third speaker is Mr. Vishanti Anzelini. He's with the IDMC, the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center. He is the Global and Regional Analysis Manager and the coordinator of the Global Report on Internal Displacement. It's called the GRID. They just launched it, and he will give us a brief on this report. He provided support to countries in Africa and Central and Southern Asia and in the Pacific as well on disaster risk knowledge. He will talk to us about the statistical challenge in producing the GRID 2023 report. And our third speaker from Lebanon, Dr. Fadi Hamdan, who just joined us from the airport. He just coming from the airport straight to our headquarters in Beirut. Thank you very much for joining us. Mr. Hamdan is an international expert in DRR. He will speak about the challenges of data gaps in the Arab region and in Lebanon in particular to develop the DRR strategies and risk assessment. More in depth, Dr. Hamdan is working on city-specific and country-specific analysis of infrastructure resilience across sectors, energy, water, wastewater, etc. And also, we have with us from the participants in person, we are very pleased to have from Pakistan, Mr. Tasadduq Hussain, from the Joint Secretary, he's from the Ministry of Planning, Development and Special Initiatives on Population Data from Census and CRVS. He has a presentation and he'll talk to us on the Pakistan experience during the floods, on how the response was from their side. So we will start with Mr. Ahmed. You can join us online. Thank you very much for joining.
Thank you. Hi and greetings from Ankara. I'm Ahmet Kürşat Dostor, Vice President of Turkstat. I will give brief information about how we try to measure the impact of Kahramanmaraş earthquakes. But I can see the slides. Next slide, please. And next slides. Yes, there were actually 2 earthquakes in the same day.
1 second, Ahmed.
Okay.
We put something, questions on the Mentimeter. We would like the participants to scan the barcode and try to answer the questions that are related to this session. You will find that the questions really, we want to seek your opinions on the same questions that are addressed to the panelists. I'm sorry about that, Mr. Ahmed, so you can continue. Apologies for the interruption.
Thank you. Yes, there were actually, as I said, 2 earthquakes in the same day. One is 7.7 and the other one is 7.6. It affected 11 provinces and around 14 million of people have been affected, which is 17% of total Turkish population. In order to see the impact of the earthquakes, we started to bunch together all related statistics so as to serve them to decision makers. Next slide, please. We have been prepared reports in 5 dimensions. The first one is the economic outlook. It includes general condition before the earthquakes, the foreign debt of the enterprises in the area because there were some potential write-offs. By using whom-to-whom matrices in micro level, from enterprise to enterprises, the relationship between the enterprises in and out of the area have been figured out so that we estimated the risk of the industries and enterprises. Again, there were potential write-offs between enterprises. Finally, we use big data, the electronic bills. The e-bills have been reported daily to the Ministry of Finance, and we use that data to monitorize day by day the economic activity of the area after the earthquakes. The second one is the agriculture sector. We just show and report the general condition of the agriculture industry before the earthquake. We couldn't get any data after the earthquakes about agriculture industry. The third one is the building statistics by damage assessment situation. We work together with the Minister of Environment. The ministry sent the staff to the area and checked the buildings and classified with respect to damage. And we got that information and linked with other data sources, like the people living in that building, employment, and we produced some figure with that data. One of the important was the loss of estimated economic value of capital. We estimated that and share with the related institution that information. The fourth one is the employment. We report general conditions of the employment market in the area. We try to figure out the job loss, the labor force, etc. We use the micro data both from the labor side and enterprise side. The fifth one is the mobility. Millions of people left the area after the earthquake. And of course, it couldn't be monetized, which created some planning problems because the decision makers couldn't have any information how many people are in the area or out the area. And we started to work about that subject in order to report who is where. Next slide, please. Next, yes, thank you. The data source that we use is the Central Population Administration System, Address Registration System data, Spatial Address Registration System, Land Registry Property or Cadastral Records, Registered Employment Data, Enterprise Information System Records, Payroll Data, Farmer Registration System, and Livestock Information System. I have to say that before the earthquake, we have some information system established or built within the Turkstat. One of them is about the population. We published last year the census of population by using administrative records. We have also the enterprise information records, which includes the turnover, the employment, the export, import, etc. Also, we have some farmer information system. Next slide, please. And also we use auxiliary data sources, the education database, higher education database, the subscription records, motor vehicle records, pensioner records, etc. And all those data sources were within the Turkstat before the earthquakes. So we got that data sources before the earthquakes. Next slide, please. And for whom, who is where? We get additional information after the earthquakes. The first one is the placement in student dorms or hotels or hostels. 8, under supportive payment per household, the location, of course. The receipts from banks on the location of credit cards used. The last location of the use of credit cards by ID. The last location of registered mobile phones, the last location of purchased petroleum and the evacuation data, the last location of health service delivered by hospitals, and departure from region by road, rail, maritime, and air transport. We got all the data from the related institutions. Most of them are big data, but we discussed with the institution and we described them what we want, and they sent us micro data, but not big data. We created a hierarchical structure and create a model and show which people or who is where. Next slide, please. And here you can see we prepared a website called ifat.cbs.tuik.gov.tr. It's data public, it was official. And on that data, we showed, for example, in Ankara, how many people from Hatay or Diyarbakir or etc. By age, by education, whoever wants the information. And we share that data with the related institutions, and we can show the credit card use by provinces or the hospital use by provinces. And that information is used especially the Ministry of Interior because they have to plan the allocation of the subsidies or transfers for the people. Next slide. And that's all. Thank you for attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ahmed. It's a massive task, and we believe that the other agencies responded very quickly to share data and to provide you with, like you said, micro data on credit cards and many other data sets. It was a massive work, and just to try to help like the people who were affected. We will check the next speaker, and we will see, like we said, how on the ground also the alternative data, like the timely data, how was it helpful on the ground, and how later this type of data can be integrated with the data sets and official data that are at the statistics office. Harry, you can take the floor.
You hear me? Hello, good evening for people who are in the Bangkok.
Harry, it's not very clear. You have to check with your technology. We're saying you're a tech person. The interpreters need to hear you very well to be able to translate.
Hello, can you hear me now? Better?
Do you have a headset?
I do have headset, but can you hear me better now?
Yes. Okay. Go ahead.
Okay. Is it better, right? Okay. So good evening for everyone who attend in Bangkok, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening for those who join online. My name is Hari Mahardika. You can call me Hari. Today I'm going to share our work regarding the Turkey and Syria earthquake from our organizations called Humanitarian OpenStreetMap team. And this is related how the data can really support disaster response. So next slide, please. So Humanitarian OpenStreetMap team, or HOT, or HOT, is an international team that dedicated to humanitarian actions and also the community development, and using open mapping to support those activities, including in the disaster sectors. So our work mostly related to the mapping, capacity building, and also enhancing of the technology, especially those technology that have a free and open character. So next slide, please. So yeah, let's jump in directly to the case study for Turkey and Syria. So when the earthquake struck in Turkey and Syria areas, so one day after that, we launched with the coordinations and collaboration with the Turkish OpenStreetMap local community, and also with the partner in Syria, we launching 16 project of mapping. So the mapping project that we launched, it's remote mapping. So just for the background here, what we do when the disaster strikes, so we're launching like a activity called Mapathon. So Mapathon, it's something like marathon, but for marathon you run together. So for Mapathon, it's you mapping together in those areas. And we're launching 16 projects because the area is very big, the affected area is very big, and including 2 countries. So we have to divide those areas into 16 projects. And obviously from those 16 projects, we define the priority, because you can say there are a couple of areas that are very heavily damaged and very distraught, and there are a couple of areas that's medium damage. So we have to define those priorities. So obviously we map the high priority first. And until now, there are 9 tasking manager map and still validated until this day. So this is something that we're doing. So we not only map those areas, but together with our global mapper and global volunteer, we also validated those data for what? For later can be used for data analysis and data use cases. So this is the map of the distribution of our mapping project, as you can see. And if you can go to the next slide, please. So from those 16 project mapping activity that we had with our global mappers around the world to helping Turkey and Syria, so we collected a lot of data, including especially buildings, destroyed buildings, and also the road networks. And all of those data we uploaded into and updated them into our humanitarian data exchange page, or we usually call HDX. And from February to March, meaning like in the span of about 30 days or a month from the earthquake until March. So there are almost 2,000 downloads for those data for Turkey and Syria through the HDX page. And there are 23 OSM datasets that we define, including buildings in Turkey, roads, waterway, financial services, railways, destroyed buildings, and also in Syria, there are a couple of buildings and road network as well that people download the data. So this kind of statistics showing that if we do some kind of mapping activity to respond to the disaster, obviously there are people who need those data and use those data to further analysis, which is to support people on the ground, right? So this is a really good example how the mapping can really also increasing the, increasing the motivations for other organizations to also use the data and do something for the people who got affected. And next slide, please. And all those data, we try to, base all the numbers, right? But we try to make it more, becoming more information that people can, understand what's these numbers mean. So we try to create some kind of analysis and also helping those data used by the our partner in Turkey, OSM community there. So they try to also not only tag the buildings, but also where is the distribution of the destroyed buildings in Turkey. For example, there are a couple of thousands of destroyed building, and there are, destroyed building it's 3,000, and but affected building it's 1.7 million. So affected and destroyed, it's have a different meaning. So maybe affected, it's not really collapsed, but destroyed, it's completely gone. So this is something, another example how the data, it's really beneficial.
Exemple des données, et c'est très bénéfique pour les personnes qui...
This to share all the information or do something on the ground. And we also at HOT, we created some kind of building damage assessment where people can also learn. And when they download the data from OpenStreetMap from our HDX page, they can do something. And we try to provide the steps how they can doing that using free and open source tools. And we try to do that because free and open source tool is pretty much affordable for people who want to do something but have a limited resources or availability. So yeah, next slide, please. And in the next couple of slides, I'm just going to share a couple of use cases of the data that we collected. This is 2 examples that in Turkey that used by AKUT and AFAD, where the OpenStreetMap data that collected by the mapper globally, it's really useful for them to do the coordination to help people on the ground. So as you can see, they once the affected area it's going well mapped, so they created a map and they printed it and they brought it to the ground to use it as a discussion partner or coordination tools. So this is 2 examples. Next. So there are a couple of stories from the ground, but yeah, there is a lot of questions about this kind of initiative. But since we have a limited time, so these some kind of questions like people usually asking us. So how did we verify the accuracy? So because the mapping itself, it's using the pre-event, meaning the building is still there. So that's why the buildings that map using our mapathon, it's going to be validated later with the people on the ground. All this building will be tagged, whether this building is destroyed or whether this building is only affected. And also, this is the important why people can really access all the data. So it's not really, what do you mean? It's not really owned in the particular, place only. And what are the data quality? And this is something that also comes up. So obviously, that's why we need not only mapping, but we also do some kind of validations. both in the technical aspect and both with the information accuracy. So our work actually not only us who doing the map, but we try to, always involving local people or local community that really understand the area, which in this case, we're working with our partner in Syria and our OSM mapper local community in Turkey. And how we think OSM data could be really useful in the future for disaster response. I think we have to really more focusing instead of response. If better, we can complete those areas before the disaster happen, because we never know. So we have to do mapping, a lot of mapping activity in the context of preparedness. So if we can map together with our team or with our community in the disaster prone area, and we know there's a disaster will happen someday, but if the base map it's really accurate and it's well mapped, and then we can be relatively fast to get the statistic data and information that we need to act, fastly to help people on the ground. So I think that's something that I can share. So maybe we can have another discussion in Q&A session. So thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Harry. And just to say that the data is open data from OpenStreetMap and from the humanitarian data that they gather on the ground. And Harry would like to see to involve statistical offices. He mentioned Bangladesh, maybe with Turkey also providing the data that you collected on the ground, how it can be validated very well with the statistical office. From their base maps and from their existing official data. So thank you very much, Harry.
You're welcome. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. We can continue if you would like to go to our next panelist. Vishanti, if you are with us, can you start your intervention, please?
Yes, good afternoon and good evening there in Bangkok. Can you hear me well? Yes, okay, great. Thank you very much for having me today. I am going to present to you the perspective of the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center in gathering data and curating this data on internal displacement, and in this case, disaster displacement, to build our global report on internal displacement that we launched nearly a month ago. That I encourage everyone to read, because the figures that we're presenting this year, as you will see in the report, are the highest ever reported in terms of disaster displacement. So there's much more analysis and presentation of the figures there. Next slide, please. Let me start by explaining to you how we measure displacement in IDMC. So in the previous very interesting interventions, and I wanted to really thank both presenters, we saw how difficult it is to collect data. No, I want to underscore that IDMC does not collect data, we aggregate it. So we monitor internal displacement in a global scope by conflict and violence and disasters. We do so for development projects in some cases, but this is very, very difficult to obtain. So our reporting is focused only on conflict and violence and disasters. And what we do basically is that we compile, triangulate, aggregate, and curate all this information. How do we do it? Well, you've seen some data comes from OpenStreetMaps, other data comes from official statistics, as was shown in the Turkey case. Other data comes from media reports, and we have even sometimes embarked in satellite imagery analysis. So we put together this information from a wide range of sources, and each source comes with its own terms. So sometimes it's evacuees, sometimes it's IDP, so internally displaced people. And when no more information is available, we use housing destruction. As was said before by Harry, one thing is to have your house damaged, but a different thing is having your house destroyed. When the house is destroyed, we use that as a proxy for displacement. And so there is this, because of course, for instance, in the Turkey earthquake or in another disaster or a conflict event, there's just so much information in some instances that flows. And we do this exercise of triangulation that is really important. And we validate this data and publish it in our global internal displacement database and our global report. Now, Next slide, please. This does come with a series of challenges that are listed out here. First, access to data. So sometimes data is just not as easily as available. For example, in the case of the Turkey earthquake, there are many small-scale disasters that go unaccounted for, or simply we don't get to that person or that institution that is collecting the information. Also, data tends to get lost over time, or simply there are delays in putting this data together. Another challenge is to be accurate and reliable. Available data doesn't mean every time that it's reliable data, no? So part of this exercise of triangulation consists really in making sure that we are as accurate as possible and use most of the most reliable sources possible. The schedules of reporting, sometimes post-disaster needs assessments take a lot of time, and that influences the way we come up with our estimates. We are having a very hard time disaggregating the flows, meaning, for example, multiple displacement. We have seen, for example, in countries that are prone to hurricanes or cyclones, there are sometimes consecutive events that hit the same areas, and it's impossible to know how many times that single individual or group of individuals moved more than once. So this is another challenge. The issue of definitions, not only of the number of evacuees, etc., but concepts, metrics. It's not always as straightforward. Many countries and governments are simply not tracking the number of people who are displaced by disasters. So we are having to apply this proxy analysis. Sometimes there's lack of consistency between agencies, obstacles to collection and analysis. Sometimes it's just a question of access, right? The Pakistan floods last year inundated around 10% of the country. So you may imagine how difficult it was for people who were collecting this data to access some of these areas affected, right? Understanding sometimes the causes and triggers. And also the humanitarian community has a lot of turnover. So we lose contact and continuity to these initiatives. And all of this basically comes to wrap up these sets of challenges. Next slide, please. I wanted to underscore, out of all of these challenges, a couple that I think are very critical when it comes to putting together disaster displacement data is the importance of reliability. Why? Because depending on the region, and when you see this chart, on the left, you have the regions, and on the right, the type of kind of source, right? Fortunately, 75% of the data comes from governmental authorities, be it national or local level authorities, right? But in some countries and some regions, and this is at the regional level, but if I go down to the national level, things will vary significantly. And in some countries, there are so many gaps that we rely very much on media reporting, which is not a reliable source of information and requires a lot of triangulation. So I'm not even here talking about official statistics. I'm just talking about data, whatever we can get on any country and any context, and it's not that straightforward, no? So the process of triangulation also involves basically checking what these different sources of information are saying about that specific event and how are they reporting on displacement. Next slide, please. The other issue is terms. I touched on it briefly, but I mean, in many cases, the words displaced do appear. In the disaster risk reduction community, evacuations and the number of people evacuated now became a term that is more widely used. So that helps us sometimes even disaggregating preemptive evacuation versus during or after disaster displacement. But I put in red there the concept of affected. Why? Because the Sendai framework is a great framework. It really focuses on tracking damage and loss. But we're having an issue from the IDMC perspective with this kind of over-encompassing concept of affected, because many institutions are collecting this information using that indicator, and then we don't know how many of those affected were displaced. And then we're having a hard time, and then we are forced to apply other proxy data or do further research to find that information. So the more governments put effort in having an indicator on the number of people who are actually displaced and how they fit into those affected by disasters, that would really help us unpacking the true scale of the phenomenon. And this applies also to small-scale events, because large-scale events such as the Turkey earthquake or a massive typhoon that hits the Philippines, the data normally is crunched, is put together. But that's less the case for localized floods and landslides all over the world that would unveil a very different reality about the extensive nature of disasters and the resulting displacement. Next slide. So again, of course, this is to say, calling for, of course, more data interoperability, more agreement on the terms. Another aspect is the duration of displacement. So I wanted to share this map because this map presents our latest figures on the total number of people who remained in a condition of displacement as of end of year. And as you can see, we're monitoring the globe. We're even identifying displacement in high-income countries. But I wanted you to look at Somalia, because in Somalia, as you can see, there's no data. The reporting timeframe played a role in this, because then the International Organization for Migration gladly put a report out underscoring how many people were displaced by the drought last year in Somalia. But this report came a bit too late before we wrapped up the figures. But I just wanted to underscore this case because there were more than 1 million people internally displaced by the drought in Somalia last year. And at the end of the year, it was just simply not possible to know how many people, how many of these people remain displaced. So tracking the duration of displacement is a major challenge.
Can
yes,
you?
sorry.
Yes, please. Thank you.
Yes. And then the next slide is my last one, just to show that the disaster risk reduction community can do much more in actually monitor the displacement, right? Preparedness and early warning, some data is being put together. In the emergency phase, of course, a lot of other types of indicators are put together, they're listed there. I'm not going to enter into the details. And in the recovery and reconstruction phase, and this is particularly the piece that is missing, we don't know exactly how recovery and reconstruction is helping people to go back, is helping people to end displacement. And this is what needs better monitoring.
Чтобы они более не являлись перемещенными.
People of the books and to have a better understanding of for how long people remain displaced following disasters. Of course, this is an undertaking, significant data undertaking, but it's worth the effort from a resilience perspective. So I'll keep it there, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Vicente. That's a very tough job, like you say. And, you know, the disaster come on displaced people, so it's misery over misery. And this gives us, you know, a good transition to Dr. Fadi Hamdan, who also works on disaster management in countries with high fragility, conflict, and there are many of those in our region, our Middle East region. So I hope Dr. Fadi is with us, and we will share the presentation from here. Thank you very much, Dr. Fadi, and welcome to Beirut.
Thank you. Can you hear me, please?
Yes, we hear you very well. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So I want to speak today from the perspective of disaster risk management, but how it links to challenges with sustainable development and climate change adaptation against a background of fragility and often conflict as well. And so my work is in the Middle East. It is by no means only in Lebanon. I haven't worked in Lebanon for the last 6 or 7 years. So it is in most Middle East Arab countries. If I take Dr. Wafa's 3 questions, and I start with the first question, can we go back to the first slide, please? And I start with the first question about early warning systems. When we look about what we call people-centered early warning systems, meaning that we want 4 components to be present, namely multi-hazard risk assessment, and then prediction and forecasting, then messaging, and then response plans. If we want these 4 components to be present in order to have a multi-hazard, people-centered warning system, then we need disaggregated data on exposure, on vulnerability, on response, and so on. And this is often one of the main challenges, the lack of disaggregated data, in addition to other things that I will refer to in the course of my talk, but this is one. If I jump the second question and move to the third question, I'll get back to the second question and speak about what data we need on affected people after a disaster. And here I say And I think what the last colleague mentioned as well, in a way, in the same way, we need to be careful when we are collating data after a disaster. Are we collating data to compensate, to pay people money, as governments often do? Or are we collating data to reduce vulnerability, to improve resilience, to make sure that development gains have not diminished, or to address any exacerbated development gains? So that there is something there to be very careful about. Why are we collating data? To just compensate, or is it disaster-related data or disaster risk-related data, even post a disaster? That's something very important to bear in mind. Next slide, please. And then when we speak about innovations in technology, innovations in financing as well for data, that's very important. But in many fragile and conflict-ridden countries, there are other profound challenges that hinder the availability of disaggregated data. And I keep on going back to that, disaggregated data, because if we want to link disaster risk to climate change and to sustainable development, then, I mean, for development to be sustainable, it has to be local. And to be able to judge the challenges of local development, we need disaggregated data. So going back to the challenges in data, first thing in many of these fragile countries is mandates. And by mandate, what I mean is we need a clear institution to have the mandate, not in the sense to be allowed to collate data, but to have a duty. That's the difference, to have a duty to generate up-to-date data. And then the other problem comes, you cannot give an institution the duty to develop, collate, and analyze data if you don't give it the funding to do its duty. It cannot be held accountable, and that's the other issue. And going back to innovation, and so in that sense, the innovation is not often only in technology, but we need to think about innovative financing methods for that, to achieve this objective. Again, as I said, the issue of disaggregation, whether it is related to sectors or districts or sub-districts, is very important. As I think the previous colleague mentioned, what we call extensive risk, meaning not only the earthquake that comes once every 200 years, but the flash flood that comes 4 times a year and affects development gains in poor rural areas and poor informal settlement areas. This often goes, disaster data there often goes under the radar, unchecked. And it is a missed opportunity, because when many of these countries say we don't have money to address these issues, no one is even registering what are the losses, the human impact of these extensive risks. And then often we have to bear in mind the fact that data collation is being driven more often than not in these countries that I'm speaking about, is being driven by UN agencies, by international NGOs, and so on, means that there is weak demand for such data. And that in itself means that the data is not feeding the science policy interface. And once we realize that, we understand why there is no disaggregated data, because there is no demand for it to feed the science policy interface. And that is a major challenge. Next question, please.
For participants online to mute your microphone, and Dr. Fadi, we can we have 3 minutes to continue.
I have my stopwatch on. I think I have 4.
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead. It's very insightful, actually. It's very insightful. Thank you.
Still 4. So another set of missing data is what we call data. Again, of course, we're referring to the human impact, but we need to link it to development, to human development. And so what is also missing is data related to what we call as disaster risk drivers, that if they are present in any country, the human impact of a disaster will be much worse. And these are unchecked urban expansion, weak governance, weak risk governance, and weak risk data governance, environmental degradation, poverty, rising inequality. All these, again, we miss the data for, and we miss disaggregated data for, which makes us unable to link between disaster risk related data and disaster risk driver data. Next slide, please. Okay, so all this was before the emergence of what we call as systemic risks, meaning, as we saw in COVID-19, a risk that started in the health sector in one particular country that jumped all over the globe, and from the health sector affected all other sectors without any exclusion. And so the issue of systemic risks and data for systemic risk and disaster systemic risk data is even more challenging. Next slide, please. And so when we speak about systemic risks, we have to bear in mind that in the era of climate change and the interaction between climate change, the systemic risk, disaster risk data, and impacts on challenges on human development, we have three rising characteristics that are extremely important. One is uncertainty, and this is very important. I know I'm speaking to an audience of statisticians and data specialists, but from a disaster risk perspective, we now say that the past is no longer a reliable indicator of the future. And this is huge, even in countries that have proper statistics offices. And the other is rising inequality because of the inequality in exposure and vulnerability to climate change. And the third is rising injustice because of this interaction. And all this is having significant impact on human development gains, on violent extremism, on state fragility and social cohesion. And this is some of the main issues that we have to grapple with in the Middle East region when we speak about the lack of disaster-related data. And if I can jump to the last slide, if I can take half a minute left. Yes, so many say now we have left the Holocene and we have entered the Anthropocene, and that would create a different set of data challenges. The UNDP says that in the same way that they helped shift, and with other UN agencies, shift the focus from just a focus on human development on GDP to a focus on what we call the Human Development Index. Now they say we need to look at planetary adjusted human development indices. The governance, I would say, the governance for systemic risk data is so much challenging, much more than the governance for regular risk data, which was a problem in many areas in the region. And finally, we always have to think, are we collating disaster data or disaster risk data to reduce future exposure and vulnerability and improve human society resilience? Thank you very much, and sorry for taking too much time.
And it's really insightful, making us think, why do we really collect data? And you make us think about it. And just also for policy making, it's something that, you know, governments and people should think about. So thank you very much. It's very insightful. Just to say that all the presentations will be on the website. We have just a very short intervention from the Ministry of Planning of Pakistan. And we would like to see your questions to the speakers in the chat. Thank you.
Thank you, Wafa, for giving us some time to present a case study of Pakistan. Just for the sake of building the context, the last monsoon was horrible for Pakistan, as the flash floods, hill torrents, landslides, they played havoc with the country's infrastructure and with the people of Pakistan, and with almost more than 17 sectors were really affected. Can you just show, do you have the slides? It's on the website. Okay. So very briefly, just 33 million people were affected, 1,700 dead, more than 12,000 injured, 5.2 million acres of land, standing crops were destroyed. And immediately we, as Dr. Fadi was mentioning about the mandate of the institution to carry out the collection of data, we immediately gave the mandate to an institution which was named by the National Flood Response Coordination Center. And that was mostly reporting on the immediate relief and rescue operations and the immediate damages which were important for the immediate decision making at that time, providing immediate relief to the affected population. Later on, we just shifted from that coordination center to the Ministry of Planning and the Bureau of Statistics, which was the department of Ministry of Planning. And we embarked upon just joint surveys with the provincial governments and with the local governments, and we prepared the post-disaster need assessment studies, and that was completed in just 1 month of just a very crucial time. And we coordinated with all the NGOs, the civil society, the academia, and with the provincial disaster management authorities. So as a result of that PDNA, we found that we had a 30 billion of damage and loss to the economy, to the infrastructure, and the bare need assessment was calculated at 16.3 billion US dollars. So on the basis of this need assessment study, we just went for the resilient recovery, rehabilitation and reconstruction framework. That framework was basically focusing on the 4 strategic recovery objectives: the improving governance and capacities, restoring livelihood, ensuring social inclusion, and restoring basic services. So this was the basic sort of need requirement of the country. And at the same time, we also embarked upon a long-term program of resilient reconstruction. So we went, there was later on, this 4RF strategy was presented in the donor conference, which held on 9th of January 2023. And on the basis of those estimates, the Pakistan managed to secure around 11 billion US dollars of pledges. Mostly they are loans, and by the multilateral and bilateral partners. So we're showing this. So in the nutshell, the damage to the economy has resulted into a barely 0.8% of the growth during the last year, meaning thereby that we lost indirect damage of more than 3% of the GDP. So this is the whole story about Pakistan. Over to you, Wafa.
So hopefully you can invest in resilience, like Dr. Fadi said, with the pledges and the planning for longer term preparedness. Thank you very much for helping us in this session. There are questions to the speakers. We will hear from Petra. Ms. Petra Nahmias, who is Chief of Population and Social Statistics Section, a short intervention about the importance of civil registration and vital statistics. And this is something that ESCAP works a lot on, and we are taking it over in ESCWA. Hopefully the countries will, will advance it, because it's very important, and especially in disaster management. Petra, you can start your intervention, please.
Thank you, Wafa, and I will try to be very concise. This actually dovetails very well with the decision that was recently taken by the Regional Steering Group for CRVS to not only extend the Asia-Pacific CRVS decade, which was due to finish in 2024, but also to have an increased focus on resilience. And this resilience is really linked to the CRVS systems being resilient to disasters. A well-functioning CRVS system can produce information on the baseline population, which is critical for any disaster response. But when a disaster does occur, there is a lot that CRVS has to offer in terms of protection, legal identity, service provision, but this is a separate issue to the topic at hand. So I won't go into that, but with the focus on the data, we've seen, I think, with the shock to the system that came with COVID-19, how deficient many of the systems are to be able to respond to disaster situations. Aside from the routine measurements of births and deaths and the cause of death, when a disaster occurs, is often associated with significant excess mortality, as well as the impact of the disaster itself on the functioning of the administrative services of a civil registration system. So it's really important that these services not only can continue to provide service during a disaster, but they're going to have to also be able to register, unfortunately, many additional deaths. Many of those deaths will be occurring outside of hospital facilities. And ensuring that we can measure excess mortality, that we can improve the recording of causes of death, so we can attribute them both to directly those caused by disaster and also the indirect impacts following a disaster. This is really important to be able to inform public policy. So in terms of the way forward, how can we strengthen these systems? How can we make sure that they are more resilient? We've identified a few areas which need additional focus. One of them is the move to digitization. When the systems are digitized, this makes them more robust and resilient. We also need to make sure that there's systemic strengthening throughout for these systems. And it's very important to ensure that there's integration and collaboration with the health sector, which will also be involved in any disaster response. So these three areas are where we see that we can focus efforts in order to ensure that the systems are more resilient. With that, I will say thank you and hand back to you, Wafa.
Thank you for this. And I think there are a lot of resources on CRVS, on ESCAP and the UN sites. There are questions for the speakers in the chat. We appreciate if the speakers can give the links and answer the questions of the participants. We have the answers for the Mentimeter. So we'd like to see what our participants thought about the questions we put on the Mentimeter. So the first one, did you previously contribute to citizen-generated data on a case of disaster? We see that it's something U20 did not contribute, 10 don't know what it is, and 17 said yes. Do you accept to contribute in the future? So majority say yes, because it's for the, like we say, data for good, data for public use. So that's good that most people accept to contribute in the future. Next one. Do you think the number of victims of a disaster in your country is correctly reported? So what do we have, Hakan? We have 20. No, it's underestimated. And then 15 say yes, it's reported correctly. And we don't know, like 7, and it's overestimated 4. So that's sad because maybe people think more people die than what's reported. Next one. Do you find value on official statistics on the number of people and households and their locations from census and surveys to be used in disaster statistics? A majority say yes, and 4 said no. So next time you have a census or a survey, please answer because you see it's useful. And then what are the major challenges in the production of statistics on human impacts? So it's coordination and data sharing. This is really like the big problem. And these are problems that can be solved if we work together. It's not something that's not feasible. Other things, what can we see here? Lack of, same thing, lack of coordination, resources. But I think bringing the agencies together for coordinating will reduce a lot of the resource needed. So I think with this, we're 5 minutes beyond our time. Thank you very much for all the speakers and for our participants online. And we pass on to the session, the last session for the day.
Thank you so much, Wafa, for this very interesting.
Muchas gracias, Wafa, por esta sesión tan interesante. Ahora tenemos 5 minutos para descansar antes de pasar a la próxima sesión.
I also want to take the opportunity to remind all of you to complete the participant survey. It was first circulated yesterday, and we just put again the link to that survey also in the chat on Zoom. So whenever you have the chance, please do respond. As Wafa says, the responses are really useful for multiple purposes. Thank you for that. So we will start again in 5 minutes from now. Instead of switching it on and off, because there's that visibility.
Good evening, colleagues. May I invite you to please take your seat again. Otherwise, we will be here until midnight. I promise. That's a promise that I will keep if I don't see everyone in their seats. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, colleagues here in Bangkok and the rest of the world, good day. We are now on session 6, one of the most interesting session and the most interesting time of the day. And especially interesting for one of our panelists who is all the way back in Canberra. So it's now 12 midnight and we have to give him a round of applause when I call his name. So we are on the session measuring disaster impacts on environment and cultural heritage, which will be taking place from now, hopefully till 10 in the evening, around that time, and Bangkok local time. So if you can move to the next slide. So please. Just click it on. You've seen these pictures, or most of you have seen these pictures. And these are basically the disasters that's happening and that has been happening around the world. Now, when disasters like this occur, of course, government's first concerns would be the loss of lives and finding ways to retrieve as many people as possible and keep deaths to a minimum. Then comes the question of how badly the country has been affected by the disaster. Next, of course, is how many died in the event. Governments have to face the question of what are the damages to properties and how much, or what is the impact to the economy in general. What will be the resources required to get these economies back on their feet? Having a clear framework for capturing and valuing the effect of disaster properties to properties and economy then becomes very critical. It is imperative to implement frameworks that can be used to generate disaster and disaster-related statistics. This session is envisaged. Please move to the next slide. To provide a venue to discuss country and regional experiences in measuring disaster impacts, particularly focusing on the system of environmental accounting as a coherent framework that provides a more comprehensive and multi-purpose view of the interrelationships between the economy and the environment, and the extent to which it captures the impacts of disasters. We will also try to understand the use of geospatial information and other Earth observation data for capturing information after a disaster. And finally, we want to have some valuation on the losses due to disasters that are accruing to cultural heritage. To achieve these objectives, we need to answer key questions, including how can SEA support the production of disaster-related statistics? What technology are used in measuring disaster impact? And what type of quick wins do we see to stimulate the usage of geospatial science and technology for disaster monitoring and management? Then finally, how can we measure the disaster's impact on environment and cultural heritage? To help us answer these questions, we have the following distinguished panelists. For topic 1, on the SEA, disaster-related statistics, and ecosystem. Joining us online at this very holy hour in Canberra is Dr. Michael Bordon, who is currently an Associate Professor of Environmental Accounting at the Australian National University's Fenner School of Environment and Society. Prior to his university appointment, he was the Director of the Center of Environment and Energy Statistics at the Australian Bureau of Statistics, and was also a member of the editorial board of the system of SEA. Dr. Vardon has worked with more than 30 countries on the development of environment economic accounting and the statistics underpinning the accounts, as well as the author of more than 100 publications. For the second topic, we have Hassan Parto, who will share insights on assessing the environmental impacts of disaster. Hassan is the acting head of the UNEP's United Nations Environment Program's Response and Recovery Unit, Disasters and Conflicts branch in particular. Over the past 20 years, he has been leading several of UNEP's main response and recovery interventions, including post-crisis environmental assessments and designing and implementing environmental recovery programs in Afghanistan, Congo, Iraq, and more recently in Rwanda and Sudan. Most recently, he has been following the environmental impacts of the Islamic State of Iraq and Levant, or ISIL, conflict, and which is particularly happening in Iraq and the Beirut, as well as the Beirut port explosion. There's also a special focus on water resources and wetland management, among other things. Finally, the last, but certainly not the least, we have with us in person, Dr. Hemraj Ragni, to give us an insight on how the 2015 earthquake impacted on Nepal's cultural heritage. Dr. Hemraj here is the Deputy Chief Statistician of the National Statistics Office of Nepal, or formerly the Central Bureau of Statistics. He has been working for 25 years in statistics, official statistics, and food security with the NSO, also with the Ministry of Agriculture and Livestock Development, and the UN FAO here in Bangkok, under the Project on Global Strategy to Improve Agriculture and Rural Statistics in Asia and the Pacific region. He has been working on food security, SDG monitoring, consulting for Afghanistan, Laos, and many other countries in the region. Also, I would like to mention that the session organizer for this is Mr. Andre Nguema, who is the Section Chief of Information Management System at the African Center for Statistics in the Economic Commission for Africa. Also co-organizing with us is Mr. Hakan Yasing Siglo, statistician from the ESCAP, and also my colleague from African Center for Statistics, Aster Denico. And I am Aileen Kapilit, Senior Statistician of the African Center for Statistics Economic Commission for Africa station in Ethiopia, who will be moderating this session and trying to keep everyone on time in their presentation. So without much further ado, I would just like to request everyone who would have questions to please write them on the chat box, just to make sure that we don't miss out important information and clarification that both the audience here present in this Bangkok meeting, as well as those who are participating virtually, so that we can make sure that we have taken all your concerns. But in the meantime, I will now call on our first presenter, our first panelist, Dr. Michael Vardon. Over to you, please. There will be a Mentimentor question at the end. And if you still don't have the link to that, or can you show it again? So the style that we're going to have, it is a seamless presentation, and therefore I will only intervene when we are running out of time. But after the third presenter, I will come to ask the questions or ask the questions for you if you have questions in your mind. So we are giving our presenters sufficient time for them to make their presentations, and then the rest of the time would be on question and answer. So if you don't ask questions, we will be asking you questions. Right, Hakan? Okay. If you're ready, Michael, we're ready. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eileen, for that introduction, and thank you to the organisers for making time for this important topic. I see that there are many people there from the UN in ESCAP, in ESCWA, and in the Economic Commission for Africa. So it's very nice to see this and to have the audience and to have the statisticians in the room with the disaster statistics people and the disaster managers. If we could have the next slide, please. There is a lot of information to get through. I can literally talk for hours on this, as I know many other people too. So it is going to be a very quick tour of how the SEER might work. But first I want to stop with what the SEER is. Many people are unaware of it, or they may have some knowledge, at least it exists, but not really sure of what it includes. But I'm going to start with what it is. And firstly, it's an international statistical standard. So the countries of the world have agreed on how to measure things in the environment and the economy and how to link those together. We have about 92 countries in the world already using the SEER. Now, the SEER is all based on information from other sources. It is a way of organising information. It is not the information itself. So it draws on the information of environment statistics and economic statistics. It is accounting. People like to put things in tables. I've just put up a simple table there. It already has a place for disaster statistics in one of the accounts, and it's called catastrophic losses. So we can account for those in the regular statistics. The other point I want to make is that in the ecosystem accounting and increasingly in other forms of accounting, it's spatial. We can map things to particular areas, we can do it at a small scale, and we can aggregate to a large scale. If we can move to the next slide, please. What is the SEER? I mean, it's natural capital accounting, it's environmental ecosystem services, nature-based solutions. It's known by many things, but the SEER codifies these things. It covers stocks and flows, has physical and monetary measures, and it has benefits and beneficiaries. If all you remember about SEER is those three pairs of concepts, I will be happy. Now, I'll just quickly demonstrate this by drinking my glass of water. My throat is already dry from talking too much. Okay, that I can demonstrate all of those three pairs of concepts. There was a stock of water. It was about 200 centilitres. When I first started, I drank it. There was 50 centilitres I swallowed. There was a closing stock of 150 centilitres. That was all in physical measures. Okay, in Australia, I'm lucky. That is about 0.1 cent of a value of water. So I drank 0.25 cents of water in that. I got the benefit of drinking the water. My throat's not so sore. If I don't drink 3 litres of it a day, I die. And I was the beneficiary of that water. They're the three pairs of concepts: stocks and flows, physical and monetary measures, benefits and beneficiaries, and it covers everything that you can think of in the environment. We're going to get to a bit more of that. If that's all you remember about what SEER is, I will be very happy. We can move to the next slide. What is the SEER and how can we get it to apply to the disaster statistics? Well, it is both maps and accounts, and it takes the best things out of tables and mapping. So we can measure changes in the extent of ecosystems. So we can have forests, and there might be a forest fire and the forest burns down. We can show that the forest was lost. We can treat urban areas as an ecosystem. So a landslide or an earthquake, we can measure changes in the amount of houses and other things in that area. So We see down there on the left, we just have some maps of some fires and how the fires have changed over time in frequency and intensity in one part of Australia. On the right-hand side, we can see how the changes in ecosystems affect people and how people can affect ecosystems. So we'll get into a little bit more detail on that as we go through, but we can measure the changes in ecosystem and how they are linked to the social and economic losses by systematically organising the information. So let's just go through to the next slide. And this is how it might work. Australia, several years ago,
Il y a quelques années, a connu d'énormes incendies sur une...
В Австралии были огромные...
of it was burnt. That was due to a prolonged drought. Increased the risk due to a prolonged drought, and then we had these very big fires. The accounting on the right-hand side, we've just got the vegetation type. This is all the losses to the vegetation of different types due to those fires. On the left-hand side, we have how the fires affected water quality and water volumes in the area where I am in Canberra, in the Australian Capital Territory. So not only did we have a change to the forests, we had many houses burnt. There were, unfortunately, many people died. They were all measured. But we then had the following, the impacts on the forests themselves, which in turn had impacts on the water supply. So we lost the ecosystem services of water supply. We lost the ecosystem services of water filtration. With the accounts, we're able to target areas for restoration, to restore things so that we have more ecosystem services which are of benefit, and water is critical for that. Air filtration is another one, which is also important, but also then the loss of habitats in marine areas. If we get hurricanes or cyclones, they might destroy nursery habitat for fish as well. So once again, we have an environmental impact which has knock-on economic impacts. We also have environmental benefits from things like mangroves, which can attenuate storm surges for things like tsunami and may be able to have some mitigating effects from climate change. We can just move to the next slide. Here, it's how do we put the environmental losses in disaster risk management framework? So we've often focused on just the impact of the disaster. We can tell what area was flooded. We can tell how much was burnt. We can tell how much land was lost to landslips or other things. We have the responses in the environment. We obviously have them in the human side. You have the emergency services, but we can also protect our environmental assets, and we can also then clean up the worst affected areas. So we have the initial response, and then we have the recovery. So how do we target that? We target the expenditure. We target the activity to where we can effectively use the resources the best. We never have enough resources to do everything, so it has to be targeted. The accounts can do that. They can target it spatially. They can identify the areas where you can get the most environmental restoration, which will deliver the most ecosystem services to people. We then get to this next part, and this was very interesting with Dr. Faldi when he was talking about the difference between the disaster and disaster risk reduction. And here, I think this is where the accounts can help, because they can be used to evaluate the risks, where that we can prepare better and manage the environment to, one, minimize the risks to people and other economic losses, but also protect the ecosystems, which are vital in and of themselves, but also because of the things that they deliver people. So if we can move on to the next slide. Now, we have identified some key issues Once again, Vincenti, in the previous, one of the previous sessions, identified just consistency in definitions and scope. How do we get all that? And key to this is how do we define the environment and ecosystems? So are agricultural ecosystems within scope of environmental statistics, or are they economic statistics? And I think the answer is that they're both. We just need to look at them differently, but we need to clearly make the distinction when we're accounting for them. In accounting, particularly if we're looking at economic losses, we don't want to double count losses. We only want to count the losses once. We also need to get to the scope of the statistics, and is it just monitoring the extent of things, or are we looking at also disaster risk reduction as well? And I think the SEER offers a case for that because it can do both. Once again, the SEER is not the information, it depends on the information being available. And as we heard, that some of the data is just not there, but we need to do the best we have with what we've got. In that, we will never have perfect information, but the SEER can help target where we need the best information for particular purposes. And in this case, the purpose of disaster risk reduction and disaster risk management. In this, how do we treat climate change? In the documents that I reviewed, climate change was seen as a disaster in itself, which was currently happening, or an exacerbator of risks of other disasters. How we do that is an interesting issue. We then get to the statistical infrastructure. Once again, Vincenti in the previous session touched on that. There is a lot of information which needs pulled together. We need coordination between agencies. We need cooperation. We need to know that it exists. We need to have access to it. My colleagues are going to talk about some of the spatial information and data which is available, and how we then get the economic spatial information to talk to the environmental spatial information, to talk to the social information. We need to have all these things together. The systems need to be interoperable. I would love one enormous dynamic central information system, but that's not going to happen. There are information agencies within each country at different levels of government which need to be able to coordinate. Terminologies, definitions, and metrics. We all need to agree on what we're measuring and the metric that we're going to use. For water, I used centiliters. In America, we might use acre feet, and other things for fire intensity, air pollution, water pollution, and whatever it is. All of this are key issues. In this, there was a paper that was written, which I believe is available and has been circulated on the disaster-related statistics for environment and ecosystems. Hopefully the organisers are able to share that with you. I can certainly share it with people who are interested. So I think that's the end. If we just scroll forward, I'd like to thank you. I think I've gone a couple of minutes over time. So apologies to the organisers, Eileen, for that.
Perfectly okay, Michael, considering your time. We thank you for the very insightful presentation, and we will remember what's the three basic pairs of concepts that you described. Oh, just to make sure, it's like the stock and flow, the physical and monetary measures, and the benefits and beneficiaries that are important concepts for SEA. Now we move on to our next panelist, please. Hassan Parto. Over to you, Hassan.
Good evening, everyone. It's a great pleasure for me to have this opportunity to share with you the UN Environment Programme's experience in assessing the environmental impacts of disasters. I will be very much looking at the response and recovery phases, which were shown, in the diagram by Michael on the life cycle of disasters. Next, please. So there are well-established protocols internationally and mechanisms to assess the environmental impacts of disasters, and these are essentially categorized by phase. You have rapid assessments, and then you have also the recovery-based assessments. The rapid assessments essentially are those assessments which are carried out immediately after the disaster incident or event. It's usually within the space of 72 hours up to 6 weeks. There is within the UN system the UNEP OCHA Joint Environment Unit. OCHA stands for the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, so it's very much linked to the humanitarian response to the disasters, and embedded in that is a unit that deals with environmental emergencies that arise from disasters. Now, these types of assessments can again take two forms. Either they are part of an overarching mechanism, the UNDAC, the UN Disaster Assessment and Coordination setup, which addresses a range of sectors. And if there is an environmental and prominent environmental dimension, then an environmental expert may be deployed as part of this mission. And then there are also standalone rapid environmental assessments. For example, if you're looking at a specific oil spill incident or failure of a mine tailing, then a dedicated environmental assessment may be carried out. In terms of the recovery assessments, there is a long-standing mechanism which is known as the post-disaster needs assessment, the PDNA, which is a mechanism set up jointly by the World Bank, the EU, and the UN to assist countries in assessing the needs and mobilizing resources for the recovery. Usually they cover all the sectors in the national account system, so 1720 sectors, and environment is taken as the cross-cutting sector. Then in some cases, countries might have a specific request where environmental issues are prominent to request UNEP to conduct a specific post-disaster assessments, for example, as happened with the series of countries that were impacted by the Asian tsunami in 2004. Then there are also thematic assessments on specific topics like disaster waste or water quality. Next, please. So focusing more on the PDNA, because this is where there is kind of more detailed analysis looking at the short to medium term impacts and damages. Basically, it's organized around two main pillars of damages to assets and infrastructure, and losses in terms of economic flows and income, and from the environmental perspective, ecosystem services. So damage is assessed in terms of physical damage to the asset, whether it's complete or partial, and is measured in physical units, as was indicated. It could be that the housing square meters, road kilometers, a number of hectares of forest or protected areas which are damaged, and these are given a monetary value which is based on either the repair or replacement cost of those specific assets at prices prevailing just before the crisis. Now, a key aspect of this is, of course, having a unit cost. So countries might have their unit cost, for example, the cost of rebuilding 1 kilometer of road or reforesting a hectare of destroyed forest, or it might be formulated specifically for that incident. Losses is a more challenging, typically, area to calculate, and that essentially refers, because of the nature of economic losses, in terms of losses in fisheries, in yields of fisheries or of agriculture, timber production, and they can also relate to lower revenues and higher operational costs due to dysfunction of services, whether it's waste management, water, electricity, and health, and also losses in terms of the general livelihoods, where natural resources, especially for the rural communities, plays an important part of their livelihoods. Also included under losses is the removal and cleanup of the debris, which is generated by the disaster event. Next, please. So just examples of environmental damages, some were already mentioned. These could be losses of forest protected areas, decline of wildlife populations, damages to pollution treatment facilities and waste management facilities, to the actual environmental administration in offices, records and data management systems, labs, and monitoring equipment. And the losses there for measuring ecosystems is particularly challenging because you're looking at like sometimes non-directly tangible elements. For example, the carbon sequestration value of lost forests, the impacts of saline water intrusion into coastal groundwater aquifers due to a cyclone or a tsunami, the filtration capacity of ecosystems of pollutants, the revenues which are generated also from fees to visitors to protected areas. So these are the elements that need to be included in the losses side in terms of ecosystem services. Next, please. So some of the key data challenges, I think there is kind of a fundamental challenge is that the environment is typically viewed as an externality. It's not included, budgeted in the national accounts in many countries and situations. So that, for example, if you're to draw from natural resources, quarrying material or mining, that it is taken for granted. Pollution, again, is also not always internalized in the costs of damages. There's a challenge with the not having enough developed environmental monitoring systems so that you have a contextual baseline to assess the damages. The timing is also a major challenge in that a lot of these assessments are done typically in 3-4 weeks now, especially that there are many disasters, unfortunately, hitting many countries. So the turnaround is becoming faster, and that means, again, less time to assess complex issues like environmental damages. The templates for environmental data collection are not fully standardized, and so they tend to be reinvented by disaster for each context and situation. Monetary evaluation, again, of ecosystem services is challenging. It's often done by proxy, by, for example, looking at payment for ecosystem benefits, and just generally also in a disaster situation where, of course, a lot of the focus is on the supporting impacted civilians, key economic assets, whether it's agricultural fields or infrastructure. Data collection for environment is generally given a lower priority. Next, please. So moving on to maybe the geospatial sides and how satellite image analysis and artificial intelligence can help us in quantifying the impacts of disasters. I'd like to use the example of disaster waste or disaster debris because it's generally generated in almost most disaster situations. Now, typically calculating the volumes of waste or generally done would have been done manually, trying to identify the structures and buildings which were impacted. But with artificial intelligence, there are opportunities there to, through segmental semantic segmentation and neural network analysis, to identify the damaged buildings by looking at each pixel and where it falls as a damaged or background information. So you can really scale it up and get an overview of the volumes of debris that are generated, and then can overlay that, for example, with population data to determine the exposure of the population. Next, please. And for example, in the Turkey Syria earthquake, we used this AI approach to do simulation to help inform debris management options. As you can see, the darker colors indicate higher volumes of debris in impacted towns and villages. And based on this information, we are able to develop debris management strategies, varying from outright disposal to actually promoting recycling of this material, because from an environmental perspective, we would always like to reduce the zero waste, go towards zero waste, and promote circularity in the management of materials. And through this, we can look at different options of the workload, the cost-benefit analysis of the different management options, and the time that it would take to manage this debris. Now, this can be applied to many other aspects as well, forestry, and modeling of pollution as well. I'll end up here, and happy to follow up on the discussions. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Hassan. So, and I guess we're running out of time. So let me have my colleague here, Hem, to present the last thing that we should know for today.
Thank you, Ellen. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, everyone. Now I am going to share a little bit about measuring disaster impacts on the cultural heritage, which is quite difficult task. My presentation will basically focus on the latest experiences from the Nepal earthquake, which was occurred in 2015. Next slide, please. My outline of presentation will basically focus on these three questions. How did we measure economic loss on our cultural heritage attributed to the 2015 earthquake in Nepal? What were the data collection challenges? And then the last one, what kind of disaster-related statistics were produced? Next, please. Let me start with few figures. You can see on the left-hand side, which is the very famous white tower called Dharahara, which is more than 200 century old, which was actually, it's not in place right now, 200 years old. And then on the other side, you can see the situation after the earthquake. Next, please. This is the very famous place called Kathmandu Darbar Square. On map A, we can see, which is also the UNESCO World Heritage Site. There are 7 UNESCO World Heritage Sites inside the Kathmandu Valley, and this is one of them. You can see this is the old palace used by monarchs at that time. And then you can see the B side, the C side, D side. This palace is also called Nautale Darbar, that means 9-story palace, which was basically built by mud and then bricks, not using pillars because it was quite old. And then we can see the different sides, the south face, the north face, the original face, and even the displacements, how they have been occurred. due to that earthquake. Next, please. These are some of the statistics that we collected via PDNA that we were discussing before. The post-disaster need assessment that was immediately done after the earthquake, which was recommended by the World Bank and EU, and the activity was led by the National Planning Commission in Nepal. We exactly don't know how many monuments are there, how many cultural heritages are there inside the Kathmandu, because Kathmandu is the ancient city, may have been inhabited 2000 years ago, and then there are many temples which are very old, more than 1000 years old. There are many palaces which are more than 200 or 100 years old. Even there are many private buildings which are even 100 years old. The few are still using those monuments, mostly not. We counted that around 1000 exact numbers. 920 cultural monuments were affected. Then the loss was on the right hand side. You can see the loss in different sectors. The loss was quite high. It was around $169 million. This was the damage for the heritage sector. We divided this total loss into different sectors. Loss in the housing and human sectors, and then loss in the productive sectors, loss in the infrastructure sectors, and then loss in the cross-cutting issues as recommended by the PDNA. And then the total value of disaster effect, which includes both damage and loss, was around 706 billion Nepali rupees. And then on that particular heritage sector, it was around $169 million. Next, please. These are some of the backgrounds according to the broad sectors. We can see the social sector contributes around 58% of the total damage and loss. This social sector includes household sector, the private dwellings as well. That's why the loss is quite high on that sector. We can see the cross-cutting sector is relatively low, which is just 7%. The manufacturing sector contributes around 10% because Kathmandu is not an industrial city. It's an historical city, as I already highlighted. And then the other productive sectors like agriculture and many others, they contribute around 25%, the service sector as well. Then damage and loss, we can see in billion Nepali rupees. The damage is quite high, which is around 570 billion Nepali rupees compared to the losses, which is around 189 billion Nepali rupees. All these estimates were done by the team of the experts which were included on the PDNA process, which was led by the country's National Planning Commission at that time. Next, please. Then how did we measure economic loss on our cultural heritage attributed to 2015 earthquake in Nepal? We basically used these three methods, estimating the direct economic loss, the indirect economic loss, and other indirect impacts, as highlighted by the previous speaker. The loss of the heritage sector was estimated on the following assumptions. It is estimated that the decline in revenue from ticket sales, because the damage was already estimated at the replacement cost. And then the loss was estimated at the ticket sales because these are the UNESCO World Heritage Sites. And then even the tourists and other visitors will have to pay the entrance fee to visit those places. And then the loss was occurred in that part as well. And then we did some trend analysis, how much revenue was collected in the previous years, in the previous months. And then the preliminary monetary loss was set at around 10% of the total damage and loss, which was close to $17 million, 169 billion Nepali rupees. Next slide, please. Let me focus a little bit on the data collection challenges. There are quite a lot of challenges, but the main challenge was we even don't have the baseline data for cultural heritage. I highlighted that Kathmandu is a historical city, ancient city. Many even private buildings has become heritage. According to the national law, if a property is more than 100 years old, then it becomes a heritage. And now many private properties has become cultural heritage. And then we don't have the exact information on all those cultural heritage. We have particularly the information on the religious sites, the temples, monasteries, and many other towers and buildings. The lack of detailed inventory of the cultural heritage. Then the another issue was the skilled manpower on the field of disaster management, particularly on estimating the economic loss and damage. The issue was also the standard guidelines to measure the economic loss. Though the PDNA and other issues developed by the international agencies, they have a clear guideline how to estimate the damage, but it's still confusing on how to estimate the loss. The coordination is always an issue. Who will lead the process? The Planning Commission or Ministry of Home Affairs or Disaster Management Authority or the Statistics Office. That was another issue. And then like a country, like a developing country in Nepal, the financial resources are also constraints to establish all these systems. Next, please. We actually produced the disaster-related statistics by the DRSF. The statistical framework that we were discussing at the afternoon as well, and then by geo-region, by hazard types, and in that DRSF in Unit 6 we can see direct impact on cultural heritage. There is a subsection on Section 6 where it has been divided into different subsectors. 6.1 is direct impact on cultural heritage zones like UNESCO Cultural Heritage Site, National Cultural Heritage Designations, Urban Heritage, other heritage designations, and then 6.2 is basically the direct impact on cultural heritage objects, buildings and monuments, cultural heritage valuables, other cultural heritage. We followed these recommendations provided by the international guidelines, the DRSF, and accordingly we produced the impact of the disaster on the cultural heritage. Next, please. That's been done. Thank you. If you have any questions, then I will be happy to respond.
So let's give a round of applause to all our panelists for their very insightful presentations. And now we're opening the floor for question and answers. So please, on the chat box, there's one question from Chukwemeka Onyesu, and this is for Hassan. What methodology did you use for the PDNA? Hassan, can you turn on your camera? And also I invite Michael to please turn on your camera. Thank you.
Well, sorry, I'm not sure if my camera is coming up or if I'm having an issue with that. But the PDNA, I mean, it is an established methodology, which, as I mentioned, is looking at the damages and losses, and using that to assess the needs. I shared on the link here the guidelines which have been produced by the for assessing the environmental damages there. So I think as I mentioned in my presentation, we focus on collecting information with national partners, whether they have surveys or forms, to calculate the damages to the environmental assets. There's consultations which are conducted or with civil society as well, to try to obtain as much information as possible to inform the assessment. But the PDNA already has an established methodology to calculate these impacts. Thanks, and over.
Thank you very much, Hassan. So for Michael, has any country used the SEA for disaster statistics? Michael?
Yeah. No, thank you very much, Elaine. To my knowledge, no country has explicitly used the SEA in disaster statistics. It's one of the research projects we have going at the Australian National University, is how we use information systems and SEA as one of the outputs of the information systems. certainly lots of countries could. And just returning to what Hassan was saying a bit earlier, that we're often reinventing wheels and we're trying to scramble information from many sources. What we're trying to do is make the best of what we have and then trying to assemble it. One of the issues, I think, is the multiple agencies within countries, and then how do they know what is needed to put it together in a coherent framework before the disasters happen, so that when they do happen, that they can respond, but then also afterwards, how they can prepare for future disasters. So all of that to say no, but it could be, and we're looking for how it could be done to build off the existing information systems and existing ways to do that. And certainly if we looked at the other frameworks which were there, we can see how they could all fit together to try to make a more coherent whole.
Thank you very much, Michael. And for him, what other major hazard disasters are occurring in Nepal, which you think you would have use of this the disaster related statistics framework?
Thank you. I have already highlighted the issues of the earthquake. Nepal is prone to many other disasters as well, and not only the geological disasters like earthquake, but hydrometeorological disasters like floods, landslides induced by floods, and then even there are human-induced disasters like fires, both household level fire and forest fire, and even the other epidemics and others. But even the new disaster has been arised recently, which is the thunderbolts, the lightning. Lightning kills a lot of people in Nepal recently. We generally use this PDNA process when there is a mega disaster like earthquake, or there is a big flood in certain part of the cities on the southern part. We generally have those floods, like my colleague from Pakistan was referring before. We have small level disasters in the coverage, mainly in the mountains, the avalanches, even the glacier outburst floods. This type of disasters also occur, but not very frequently. Very rarely they occur. And in that situation, we simply use that DRSF, the disaster related statistical framework, to measure the impact. And in case of the mega disasters like earthquake or big floods, then we use the PDNA process. We estimate the damage and as well as we estimate the loss, indirect loss caused by the obstruction of those facilities, services. In this way, we are using the statistical framework. We are also using SIA in the statistical activities, but not for the disaster related activities. You know? We are particularly using the SIA for making the accounts. We are making land account, we are planning to prepare the forest account, we have already prepared waste account, which are based on the SIA, but regarding the disasters, we have not yet used the SIA methodology. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hemraj. Are there any more questions from the floor? Otherwise, oh yes, please. We have from.
Thank you. I have just a question to Deputy Chief Statistician of Nepal National Statistics Office. I follow with interest the presentation on the results of PDNA for the 2015 earthquake. The first part of the question is after the earthquake, how long does it take before you conduct the PDNA? Because it seems the data is like data collected is very good. So I'm just wondering how long is it after the 3 months like PDNA usually run the trainings? Oh, I'm not sure.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah, thank you.
It was in 2015 April the earthquake occurred, which was around 7 scale in Richter scale, 6.9 in Richter scale at that time. There were around 9,000 human casualties, now 9,000 deaths, and then more than 20,000 injuries. A lot of households were damaged. Only the damage was very big on the household sector. Then immediately the focus of the government was on the rescue, relief, and then rehabilitation. No? I think around 1 or 2 months, the whole focus of the government as well as international community was on the rescue and relief. But we completed this PDNA within 6 months after the earthquake. The earthquake was occurred in April, and then the PDNA process was completed around September, October, as I remember exactly.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hem. So much as I like the audience here and virtually we want to ask questions. I'm sure all our panelists can be reached. We will, if you want to contact them, please. Maybe they will provide their email addresses. But now I think I have to go to the next slide, Por. And because we're now on the time where we have to conclude this session. And the key takeaways for this section is having a clear framework for capturing and valuing the effect of disaster to lives, properties, and economy is critical. SEA, and for that matter, PDNA, could support the production of disaster-related statistics. And as Michael pointed out very clearly, we do not need to reinvent wheels. We just need to make the best use of the available framework and resources and make these things work for a country, make it coherent so that it will work for any country. And the rapid advancement in technologies like geospatial and geo-AI, as discussed and described by Hassan, provides opportunities to produce data and statistics as and when disaster happens. Guidelines are there to estimate directly and indirectly the impacts of disaster. We do not have to wait for major disasters to happen. Communication, collaboration, and coordination, as what happened in Nepal in the 2015 earthquake, which made it possible to produce the statistics that are seemingly impossible to produce in 6 months. What is important is we need to move, and every day is the best day to start something. So that's the challenge, not just to everyone. And with this, I would like to thank our panelists, Michael Bardon and Hassan Parto from the UNEP and Hemraj from National Statistics Office. We do have Mentimeter questions. Just to see how everyone reacted to this session, give us maybe just 2 minutes. Can you show us? Can you share the screen? Okay. Do you produce disaster-related statistics to the environment in physical terms? Yes, 18, no, 17, balance. And there's the I don't know, which is the hardest to determine. Next. Do you produce disaster-related statistics related to the environment in monetary terms? 25 no, yes 8, and 4 don't know. Next, please. Do you produce disaster-related statistics to damage disaster-related statistics related to damage to cultural heritage? Yes is 8, 25 no, the rest I don't know. Next slide, please. What are the challenges in compiling statistics on disaster impacts on the environment and cultural heritage? We see resources, coordination, lack of data, coordination. So mostly coordination and the mandates and funding and as you can see, everywhere you see almost coordination. So which is what happened in Nepal, a perfect example on what coordination can do in terms of producing the statistics that we need when we. So with that, I would like to end this presentation and thank all the panelists and the very patient audience. So Michael, now you can rest and sleep. Thank you very much for keeping us awake. And Hassan, thank you very much for joining us in Geneva. And finally, Hemraj, thank you very much for being a wonderful in-person participant. Thank you, everyone, and have a good day. I turn over the mic to Rike for some announcements.
Maybe dinner. It's too late for dinner here, Eileen. Well, let's just also give the session chair, Eileen, a round of applause here. So thank you for a wonderful second day of this year's expert forum. I don't think I have any announcements except to say, well, same place and time tomorrow. Everyone who's here in Bangkok, we meet again at 2 o'clock tomorrow afternoon. And we continue with the hybrid sessions at 7 p.m. Bangkok time tomorrow. So we look forward also to again connecting with the virtual audience at that time. So have a great night and a good morning tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.